Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside with your coffee, and finding a violation notice on your door. Your crime? A single leaf on your driveway. Ridiculous, right? Well, that was just the beginning. Meet Karen, self-appointed queen of the HOA, clipboard in hand, armed with an endless list of made-up rules and a thirst for absolute control. At first, I tried to ignore her. Then I tried to reason with her. Big mistake. Karen didn't just want order, she wanted power. And she was ready to destroy anyone who stood in her way. But if she thought I was just going to roll over and let her run my life? Oh, she had another thing coming. It was a peaceful neighborhood. One of those places where people smiled at each other, kids rode their bikes in the cul-de-sac, and weekends were spent grilling in backyards. Life was good. At least, it was until she arrived. Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Armed with a clipboard, an iron will, and an attitude bigger than her perfectly manicured lawn, she took it upon herself to keep the neighborhood in order. And by in order, I mean under her rule. It started small. A passive-aggressive note on my door about my grass being a tad long. As if I had let it grow into a jungle overnight. Then came the complaint about my mailbox being slightly tilted. But the final straw? The gnome. A harmless little garden gnome sitting cheerfully by my walkway, minding its own business. Apparently, it was a violation of aesthetic uniformity. Whatever that meant, I should have laughed it off. Maybe ignored her and gone about my business. But no, Karen wasn't the kind of person you could ignore. And soon, her obsession with rules turned into something more. Something bigger. Something that threatened my very right to enjoy my own home. That's when I knew. I wasn't just dealing with an HOA Karen. I was dealing with a full-blown dictator. And if she thought I was going to roll over and let her take control of my life, she had another thing coming. She wanted a fight? She was going to get one. The first official violation notice appeared in my mailbox like an unwelcome guest. Grass exceeds acceptable length. Immediate compliance required. I stared at the piece of paper, then at my lawn. It was barely half an inch taller than my neighbor's, yet somehow I had been singled out. Then came the second notice. Trash bin visible from the street for 7 minutes past collection time. 7 minutes. 7. As if she had been standing there with a stopwatch, waiting for me to commit this grievous offense. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was inventing them. It wasn't enough for her to keep the neighborhood in check. She needed absolute control. She began patrolling the streets like a self-appointed sheriff, wielding her clipboard with the same authority a judge might wield a gavel. I once caught her standing in front of my driveway, hands on her hips, shaking her head in exaggerated disappointment. When I asked what the problem was, she pointed at a single fallen leaf. One leaf. You need to be more proactive about maintaining your property, she said, as if I had personally insulted the integrity of the entire neighborhood. Things only escalated from there. Suddenly, there were rules no one had ever heard of before. No holiday decorations past January 1st. No excessively bright porch lights. No clutter on porches, which apparently included potted plants. And yet, despite all her relentless nitpicking, Karen herself seemed immune to her own standards. Her car, an eyesore of peeling paint and mismatched hubcaps, remained parked in her driveway in clear violation of actual HOA rules. But of course, Karen didn't follow the rules. She was the rules. It became clear this wasn't about keeping the neighborhood tidy. This was a power trip. And I had just become her favorite target. I tried the reasonable approach first. Big mistake. Karen, I said as politely as possible, I checked the HOA guidelines and my lawn is within regulation. She gasped as if I had just told her I planned to paint my house neon green. The guidelines are just that, a guideline. The spirit of the HOA is about maintaining harmony. And right now, your lawn is disrupting that harmony. I blinked. My lawn was causing disharmony? That's when I knew logic wouldn't work. Reasoning with Karen was like arguing with a brick wall. Except the brick wall had a clipboard and an inflated sense of self-importance. So I switched tactics. I started small. Harmless. Petty. Since Karen had a rule for everything, I made sure to follow them to the letter. She complained that trash bins weren't allowed to be visible. I built an elaborate mini-shed for mine, HOA-approved beige and all, complete with a tiny no trespassing sign for good measure. She didn't like unauthorized lawn ornaments. I replaced my single gnome with an entire gnome village, all perfectly within regulation, of course. Karen insisted that front doors had to be in an approved neutral tone. I repainted mine exactly the same shade of beige as hers, down to the brand and color code. When she tried to complain, I handed her a copy of the HOA handbook with a grin. It's compliant, right? But the real kicker? I started documenting everything. Every ridiculous complaint, every time she bent or ignored the rules for herself, every interaction where she made up regulations on the spot. And Karen? Oh, she didn't like that. Not one bit. The more I followed the rules, the angrier she became. The more I played her game, the more she realized she was losing control. But Karen wasn't about to back down. No, she did what all HOA tyrants do when they start losing. She doubled down. Word spread fast. It started with whispers, side eyes, knowing smirks. Suddenly, I wasn't just the guy with the out-of-control lawn. I was the guy standing up to Karen. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who had been dealing with her nonsense. Tom from next door caught me outside one afternoon, glancing around before muttering. Last week, she accused my cat of trespassing. My cat. On my own property. Lisa from down the street snuck over while walking her dog. She gave me a warning because my wreath was too festive for a non-holiday month. She rolled her eyes. It was autumn leaves, not Christmas lights. And then there was Greg, the retired Marine who lived on the corner. He just chuckled and said, "She tried to tell me my American flag was too big." You can guess how well that went for her. The neighborhood was divided. On one side, there were Karen's loyal followers, those who either feared her wrath or actually believed in her ridiculous crusade. They nodded along at HOA meetings, backed up her absurd rules, and whispered behind closed doors. Then there was everyone else, the silent majority who had been dealing with her nonsense for years. And now, they had me. It didn't take long for my petty rebellion to inspire others. Tom installed a tiny cat-sized no trespassing sign on his lawn, just for Karen. Lisa doubled down on her festive decor, switching out her wreath every week just to mess with her. Greg? He put up an even bigger American flag. And floodlights. Just in case Karen wanted to see it better at night. It was turning into a full-blown neighborhood movement. Karen, of course, was furious. She started handing out violation notices like candy, practically foaming at the mouth every time someone dared to push back. But there was one big problem for Karen. She could only hand out so many threats before someone finally called her bluff. And that someone was about to be me. Karen was losing control, and she knew it. The more we pushed back, the more desperate she became. She didn't just enforce the rules anymore, she weaponized them. I started receiving multiple violation notices a week, each one more ridiculous than the last. Grass too green. Trash bins placed half an inch too far from the curb. Mailbox looking unstable. It wasn't. Then came the final straw. I woke up one morning to find Karen in my yard. Clipboard in one hand, ruler in the other, measuring my lawn. "Karen," I called, marching outside. "What the hell are you doing?" She barely looked up. "It's an inspection. Your lawn is 0.75 inches over the standard." She was trespassing. On my property. At 6:30 in the morning. Measuring my grass. That's when I knew Karen wasn't just bluffing. She was escalating. And it was time for me to strike back. I went full detective mode. I dug up every HOA bylaw, every rule, every regulation. I documented everything. I even went back through security footage. And there it was, Karen sneaking onto my property multiple times. But the real goldmine? I found dozens of HOA violations, committed by Karen herself. Her fence, the wrong color. Her trash bins, left out overnight multiple times. Her car, parked in an unapproved zone. And the best part, a massive backyard project she never got approved, which was a direct HOA violation. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to bury her. Then came the HOA meeting. Karen strutted in like a dictator addressing her subjects, binder in hand labeled neighborhood offenders. Because of course she had won. She launched into her usual lecture, dramatically flipping through complaint pages, calling out rule breakers one by one. That's when I stood up. "Karen," I said, holding up my own folder, "you seem very passionate about HOA compliance. So let's talk about your violations." Silence. I handed copies to the entire board. Pages upon pages of her own violations. Security footage of her trespassing. Photos of her unapproved modifications. Multiple rule violations she had conveniently ignored. Her face turned ghost white. The board members flipped through the evidence. Karen stammered, trying to defend herself. But the real knockout punch? I pulled out the HOA bylaws and read aloud. Any board member found in multiple violations is subject to immediate removal. A long, heavy pause. Then the HOA president turned to Karen and said the words I'd been waiting to hear. "Karen, you're out." The room fell into complete silence. For the first time since she had taken her self-appointed throne, Karen was speechless. She tried to argue, of course. "This is a misunderstanding. Those aren't real violations." But the HOA president shook his head. "Karen, we have video evidence of you trespassing. You've issued fines for violations that don't exist while ignoring your own. You've been harassing homeowners. That's not leadership, it's abuse of power." And just like that, the queen of the HOA had been dethroned. Karen's face twisted into something between rage and disbelief. "You can't do this. I've dedicated years to this neighborhood." The president sighed. "And now it's time for the neighborhood to move on." The final blow? Not only was she voted out of the HOA board on the spot, but she was also issued her own violation notices for every unapproved modification she had made, including fines. The woman who had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood with petty rules was now getting a taste of her own medicine. And it was glorious. Karen stormed out of the meeting, her precious clipboard clutched in a death grip. But she wasn't just humiliated, she was powerless. And the neighborhood? Oh, we celebrated. The next weekend, we threw the biggest block party in recent memory. Lawn chairs lined the sidewalks, barbecue grills fired up, and kids ran around freely, without Karen pacing around taking notes. Someone even set up a giant inflatable gnome in their yard as a final tribute. And the best part? That night, every single house put up extra string lights, completely HOA compliant, of course, but obnoxiously bright. Just because we could. As for Karen, well, after a few weeks of sulking, she put her house up for sale. Maybe she found another HOA to torment. Maybe she learned her lesson. Either way, one thing was certain. The tyrant had fallen. And the neighborhood? Finally free. The air felt lighter after Karen was gone. No more random violation notices. No more passive-aggressive emails about neighborhood harmony. No more clipboard patrols at sunrise. For the first time in years, people could actually enjoy their homes without fear of being fined for something ridiculous, like having a doormat that wasn't neutral enough. The HOA board even relaxed a bit. The new members were reasonable. They actually cared about keeping the neighborhood nice, not controlling every aspect of it. Instead of treating homeowners like rule-breaking criminals, they focused on actual issues, like fixing the broken streetlights Karen had ignored for years. And me? Well, I finally got to sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise without Karen lurking nearby, waiting to pounce. But the best part? A few weeks after she moved out, I got a package from an anonymous neighbor. Inside was a miniature Karen figurine, complete with a tiny clipboard, standing next to a garden gnome. A handwritten note read, "For your lawn, a tribute to the fallen dictator." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. The grass grew freely. The mailboxes stood proudly. And at last, we all learned an important lesson. Sometimes, the best way to deal with an HOA Karen is to beat her at her own game. What's the best way to deal with an HOA dictator? Fight back, outsmart them, or move out. What's the most satisfying petty revenge you've ever seen or done yourself? If you could create your own ridiculous HOA rule just to mess with Karen, what would it be? Should I put up an even bigger garden gnome in Karen's honor? Faced with tears of joy, enjoyed watching HOA Karen get what she deserved? Smash that like button and hit subscribe to join the fight against entitled HOA nightmares. Rocket. Bell turn on notifications so you never miss another wild HOA battle, petty revenge, and satisfying karma. Speech Balloon got your own HOA horror story? Drop it in the comments. I read them all. HOA Karen tries to steal my land. I make her regret it. Entitled People Reddit.